Hello, and a very warm welcome to Silent Historian. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Our goal on this channel is to create a quiet space for you, a place to unwind and explore the past, not as a series of grand events, but as a collection of human experiences. We peel back the layers of myth to find the men and women who lived, breathed, and endured these moments in history. If you find this journey calming and meaningful, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It's a small, quiet way to show your support, and it helps our community grow. So now find your comfortable spot. Let the world outside fade away and allow your breathing to slow. Tonight, we are going to strip away the horned helmets, which they never wore, by the way, and the blood-soaked axes of popular imagination. We are leaving the raid behind. Instead, we are sailing west, into the cold, grey void of the North Atlantic, to a place of fire and ice. We are going to live the life of a Viking settler in the new, untamed lands of Iceland and Greenland. And we are going to discover that the greatest battle they ever fought was not against Saxon armies, but against the land itself. Let's begin our story. Forget the image of a fearless warrior leaping from a longship onto a foreign shore. Your journey begins not with a battle cry, but with a sail. You are Carl, a farmer from the west coast of Norway. Your world is one of steep-sided fjords, where the mountains plunge directly into the sea, leaving only tiny, precious slivers of land to cultivate. For generations, your family has worked this small farm, but the land is tired, and you are the third son. There is no inheritance for you here, no future but to work for your older brother. But there are whispers, stories carried on the wind by sailors and merchants, stories of a new land to the west. An island, they say, vast and empty, with wide valleys and green pastures free for the taking. Iceland. The name itself is a paradox, a challenge. It is a place with no king, no jarls demanding tribute, a place where a man can be his own master. The idea takes root in your mind, a stubborn seed of hope. The decision to leave is not made lightly. It is a severing of roots that go back centuries. You sell your small share of the livestock. You convince your wife, Sigrid, a strong, practical woman who has more sense than you do, that this gamble is worth taking. You pack your entire world into a single ship. This is not a warship, a sleek, dragon-proud vessel built for speed and raiding. This is a nar, a fat, sturdy merchant ship with a deep belly, designed for carrying cargo, not warriors. Into this wooden ark, you load everything you own. Your few precious cows and sheep, their eyes wide with fear as they are hoisted aboard. Crates of dried fish, barrels of ale, sacks of seed grain that you pray will grow in this new soil. Your iron tools, an axe, a scythe, a plough. Your wife packs her loom, her cooking pots, her weaving combs, and you pack the disassembled pieces of your house, the timbers that will form the frame of your new home in a land you have never seen. You are not alone. Other families from your fjord are doing the same, pooling their resources, casting their lots together. You are a small, floating community of hope and desperation. The day you set sail, the entire village comes down to the shore to see you off. There are tears and grim, stoic farewells. You know with a cold certainty that you will likely never see these faces again. As the coast of Norway, the only home you have ever known, shrinks to a thin green line on the horizon, you feel a profound sense of isolation settle over you. You are no longer just a farmer. You are an adventurer, a pioneer, a gambler who has wagered everything he has on a rumor and a prayer. The journey across the North Atlantic is a brutal education in the power of the sea. You are at the mercy of the wind and the waves. The Nar is a sturdy ship, but the ocean is a relentless, indifferent monster. For weeks, you are tossed by storms, the sky a bruised purple, the waves crashing over the deck, drenching you and your terrified livestock in icy salt water. There is no shelter. You huddle under oilskins, your bodies numb with cold, your stomachs churning with seasickness. You have no compass. Your only guide is the sun on clear days and the stars on clear nights. You learn to read the flight of seabirds, the color of the water, the shape of the clouds. You are a tiny speck of wood and courage in a vast, empty wilderness of water. Some of your livestock, weakened by the journey, die. You have to butcher them on the rolling deck and salt the meat, a grim reminder of how fragile your future is. Every lost animal is a piece of your new life, gone before it has even begun. And then one morning, you see it, a line of white on the horizon, glaciers, and below them, a dark volcanic coastline, wreathed in mist. Iceland, you have arrived. You sail along the coast, looking for a place to make your home, a place with a sheltered bay, fresh water, and the promise of green land. You find a fjord that looks promising. You sail into it, and as you do, You perform the ritual of the landnam, the land taking. You throw the high seat pillars from your old house overboard. These carved wooden posts are the sacred heart of your home. The belief is that the gods will guide them to the shore, and where they wash up, that is where you will build your new life. You have put your fate not just in your own hands, but in the hands of the currents and the will of Odin and Thor. You have found your land. The pillars have washed ashore in a small, protected cove. Now the real work begins. The Icelandic summer is a fleeting, precious thing. A brief window of frantic activity before the long, dark winter descends. You have to build a home, plant your crops, and prepare for the darkness to come. Your house is not the grand timbered hall of a jarl. You are a simple farmer, and you build what you can with the materials at hand. You use the timbers you brought from Norway to create the internal frame of a longhouse, a long, narrow building that will house both your family and your surviving livestock under one roof. But wood is scarce in this new land. The island is mostly barren, with only small, twisted birch trees. The walls of your house will not be made of wood. They will be made of the earth itself. You cut blocks of turf from the rich, grassy soil. These blocks, dense with roots, are your bricks. You stack them in thick, insulating layers, creating walls that are several feet thick. The roof is also made of turf, laid over a layer of birch bark. Your house looks less like a building and more like a natural extension of the landscape, a man-made hill. It is a dark, damp, and primitive shelter, but it is designed for one purpose: to keep out the relentless, soul-crushing Icelandic wind. Inside the longhouse is a single, long room. The floor is packed earth. A long, shallow fire pit runs down the center of the room. This is your only source of heat and light. But there is no chimney. The smoke from the peat and driftwood fire simply rises and hangs in the air, a thick, greasy, eye-watering haze, before slowly filtering out through a small hole in the roof. The walls are constantly damp, slick with condensation. The air is always thick with the smell of smoke, of wet wool, of cooking food, and of the animals who are your winter roommates. You and your family live on raised wooden platforms that run along the sides of the longhouse. These are your beds, your chairs, your dining tables. You sleep on mattresses stuffed with straw under heavy wool blankets and animal skins. In the center of the room, your precious few cows and sheep are tethered, their body heat adding a small but vital amount of warmth to the space. Their presence is a constant reminder of how intertwined your survival is with theirs. Life in the longhouse during the winter is a lesson in endurance. The sun disappears for months. The world outside is a frozen, windswept landscape of darkness and snow. You are trapped in this smoky, crowded space with your family and your animals. There is no privacy, tempers fray. The darkness presses in on you, a physical weight. You pass the time with work that can be done indoors. Sigrid sits at her loom for hours on end, weaving wool from your sheep into the cloth that will clothe you. You carve tools from bone and wood. You mend your fishing nets, and you tell stories. The stories are your salvation. You sit around the flickering fire, and you recite the epic poems of your ancestors, the tales of gods and heroes, of great battles and long journeys. You tell stories of your own, of the voyage from Norway, of the building of your farm. The stories keep your mind sharp, they keep your culture alive, and they remind you that you are part of something larger than this small, smoky room at the edge of the world. They are a shield against the crushing boredom and the encroaching despair of the long, dark winter. Surviving the cold is one thing. Surviving the darkness is another battle entirely. Your life as a Viking settler is governed by a relentless, unforgiving master, the seasons. Your existence is a constant race against time, a desperate attempt to wring enough life from this harsh new land to survive the next winter. The Icelandic summer is a brief, frantic explosion of activity. The sun barely sets, and you work from the moment it rises to the moment it dips below the horizon, and sometimes beyond. Your first priority is hay. Your livestock cannot graze during the long, snow-covered winter. They will depend entirely on the hay you can grow, cut, and store during the summer months. The quality of your hay harvest is the single most important factor in your survival. A good hay harvest means your animals will be strong and healthy, providing you with milk, wool, and meat. A poor hay harvest means you will have to make a terrible choice: slaughter your precious breeding animals to feed your family, or watch them starve to death before your eyes, and then face starvation yourselves. So you work, you and Sigrid, and eventually your children, spend every waking hour in the meadows, cutting the long grass with your scythes. It is backbreaking, repetitive work. The scythe is a simple but effective tool. its long blades singing through the grass. You work until your muscles scream and your hands are raw with blisters. Once the hay is cut, it must be dried. You rake it into long rows, turning it constantly to expose it to the sun and the wind. The Icelandic weather is fickle and unpredictable. A sudden summer rainstorm can ruin a week's worth of work, turning your precious hay into a black, moldy mess. You watch the sky with a constant gnawing anxiety, praying for sun, fearing the clouds. Once the hay is dry, you gather it into large stacks, building them with care to shed the rain and snow of the coming winter. These haystacks are your bank account, your insurance policy, your measure of wealth and security. A man is judged not by the gold in his purse, but by the size of his haystacks. At the same time, you must tend to your small vegetable garden. The soil is thin and volcanic, and the growing season is short. You can't grow the wheat you were used to in Norway. Instead, you plant hardy root vegetables, turnips and carrots, and perhaps some cabbage. These small gardens, protected from the wind by low turf walls, are a vital source of nutrition, a small defense against the scurvy that can ravage a community during the long winter. And there is the sea. The sea is both a threat and a promise. The cold, rich waters of the North Atlantic are teeming with life. You are a farmer, but you must also be a fisherman. You take your small boat out into the fjord, setting long lines and nets. You catch cod, haddock, and halibut. The fish are a vital source of protein. You eat them fresh, and you spend countless hours cleaning, salting, and drying them on wooden racks, preserving them for the winter. The smell of drying fish is a constant pungent aroma that hangs over your farmstead. It is the smell of survival. You are also a hunter. In the autumn, you hunt for seabirds on the high cliffs, a dangerous and precarious business. You gather their eggs, a precious protein-rich delicacy. You hunt for seals along the coast, their blubber providing valuable oil for your lamps, their skins providing tough, waterproof leather. Every day is a calculation. Every hour is precious. There is no room for error. A broken tool, a sick animal, a week of bad weather, any of these can spell disaster. You are not a warrior fighting for glory. You are a farmer fighting for calories. It is a constant, grinding, attritional war against nature. And there are no stand-down days, no furloughs, no guarantee of victory. You are living on the knife's edge of survival. And the only reward for a summer of relentless, back-breaking labor is the chance to do it all again next year. One of the things that drew you to Iceland was the promise of freedom. There is no king here to demand your loyalty, no powerful jarl to tax your harvest. But a society without rulers is not a society without rules. In fact, the early Icelandic settlers created one of the most complex and fascinating legal systems in the medieval world. It was a society based not on the power of a single man, but on the power of the law and the consent of the governed. At the heart of this system is the thing, or assembly. Every summer, for 2 weeks, free men from all over the country gather at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. This is not just a parliament. It is a national festival, a trade fair, a family reunion, and a high court, all rolled into one. You make the long journey to the Althing, as the National Assembly is called, every few years. It is a chance to see old friends, to trade your wool and dried fish for goods you cannot produce yourself, like iron or fine cloth. It is a chance to hear news from other parts of the country, and even from Norway. But the main purpose of the Althing is the law. You stand with hundreds of other farmers on the plains, and you listen as the law speaker, a man elected for a 3-year term, recites 1/3 of the nation's laws from memory, from a high rock called the Law Rock. This is how the law is preserved and passed down in a society that is largely illiterate. It is a living oral tradition. The Althing is also where disputes are settled. If a neighbor has stolen your sheep, or if a man has insulted your honor, you do not start a blood feud. You bring your case to the Althing. You plead your case before a panel of chieftains, or godar. These are not hereditary lords, but influential local leaders whose authority rests on the support of the free farmers who choose to follow them. You can, in theory, change your allegiance from one chieftain to another. It is a system of checks and balances, designed to prevent any one man from becoming too powerful. The legal system is intricate, with precise rules for everything from inheritance and marriage contracts to the proper compensation for killing a man's cow. The goal is not always justice in the modern sense, but the prevention of escalating violence. The preferred outcome of a dispute is a settlement, a fine paid to the injured party to restore their honor and avoid a blood feud. But if a man is found guilty of a serious crime and refuses to pay the fine, he can be declared an outlaw. This is the ultimate punishment in Icelandic society. An outlaw is a man without legal protection, Anyone can kill him without penalty. His property is forfeit. He is forced to live in the desolate, uninhabitable interior of the island, the highlands, a place of glaciers and volcanoes, a place where no man can survive for long. To be an outlaw is to be a walking ghost, a man erased from the community of the living. This reliance on law and assembly creates a society that is both fiercely individualistic and deeply communal. You are your own master on your own farm, but you know that your survival and the survival of the community depends on upholding the law and respecting the judgments of the thing. It is a fragile system, built on honor, reputation, and the threat of social exclusion. It is a bold experiment in self-governance, a society of farmers and lawyers, trying to build a new world on their own terms, in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. And for a time it works. For several generations the Icelandic settlement thrives. The climate is relatively mild, the pastures are green, and the population grows. But the Norse settlers are living on borrowed time. They are unknowingly at the tail end of a period known as the medieval warm period, and it is about to end. The change is not sudden. It is a slow, creeping, inexorable shift. The summers become shorter, cooler, and wetter. The winters become longer, colder, and more brutal. The hay harvests begin to fail more often. The sea ice, which had been a distant threat, now begins to choke the northern fjords for months on end, cutting off trade and making fishing impossible. The glaciers, the great rivers of ice that dominate the interior of the island, begin to advance, grinding over pastures that once supported livestock. This is the beginning of the Little Ice Age. For the settlers of Iceland, it is a catastrophe. Their entire way of life, so precariously balanced, begins to unravel. The delicate dance of survival they have perfected over generations is no longer enough. The land that had once seemed so promising, so full of potential, is now turning against them. The impact on your family, generations removed from the original settlers, is devastating. The sheep, your primary source of wool and meat, begin to die off in greater numbers each winter, their weakened bodies unable to withstand the relentless cold. The cows, which require the best quality hay, become a luxury you can no longer afford. Milk and butter become rare treats. Your diet shifts almost entirely to fish when you can get it. Malnutrition becomes a constant companion. The bones of the people from this period, unearthed by archaeologists, show the telltale signs of rickets, scurvy, and other diseases of deprivation. The landscape itself changes. The settlers, in their desperate need for firewood and grazing land, have stripped the island of its fragile forests of birch and willow. Without the trees to hold the soil, massive erosion begins. The thin volcanic topsoil is blown away by the relentless wind, leaving behind barren, rocky deserts. The land that your ancestors described in the sagas as forested from mountain to shore is gone forever. You are living in a man-made, climate change-driven ecological disaster. Society begins to break down. The carefully balanced legal system of the Althing, which relied on the prosperity of independent farmers, begins to fail. As smaller farms fail, the land is consolidated into the hands of a few powerful chieftains. The independent farmer, the proud ideal of the original settlers, is replaced by the tenant farmer, a man who works the land for a powerful landlord, trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency. The old system of honor and law is replaced by the raw exercise of power. Feuds and conflicts become more common, more violent. This is the Age of the Stirlings, a period of civil war that will tear Icelandic society apart. You, a descendant of the hopeful farmer who threw his pillars into the sea, are now trapped. The journey back to Norway is impossible. The sea lanes are more dangerous than ever, and you have nothing to return to. You are Icelanders now. This cold, barren, unforgiving island is your home, your only home. You endure. You learn to live with less. You learn to make boats out of driftwood, to make tools from the bones of whales. You hunker down in your smoky turf house, and you tell the stories of the old days, the days of the first settlers, the days when the land was green and the future was bright. The stories are a comfort, but they are also a lament, a reminder of a world that has been lost. And this is the reality of the Viking settler. The story is not one of glorious conquest, but of a desperate, grinding struggle for survival against forces far more powerful than any human enemy: the climate, the land, and the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons. It is a story of incredible courage, of remarkable ingenuity, and ultimately, of profound, tragic loss. The men and women who settled Iceland were not just warriors. They were farmers, fishermen, lawyers, and poets. They were survivors. And their story, etched into the volcanic rock and the frozen soil of this island at the edge of the world, is one of the most compelling and human stories in all of history. You would not have survived, and in understanding that, you begin to understand the true, astonishing measure of their strength. Our story now leaves the shores of Iceland with its failing pastures and darkening skies and pushes even further west into a realm of myth and sea ice. We are following in the wake of one of the most remarkable families in the Viking world, a family whose ambition and misfortune would lead them to the very edge of the known map, and then one step beyond. This is the story of Leif Erikson, but to understand Leif, you must first understand his father, a man whose temper was as fiery and unpredictable as the volcanoes of his homeland. His name was Eric the Red. Eric was a man born under a bad star. His story, like so many Viking stories, begins with violence. Back in Norway, his father was exiled for manslaughter, and the family was forced to flee to Iceland. Eric grew up in that new, raw society, a man with a chip on his shoulder, quick to anger and fiercely protective of his honor. And in Iceland, he followed in his father's footsteps. After a dispute with a neighbor over some livestock, a feud erupted, men were killed, and Eric, like his father before him, was declared an outlaw by the Althing. He was sentenced to 3 years of exile. He could not stay in Iceland. He could not return to Norway. He had to go somewhere new, but where? For years, sailors who had been blown off course had told stories of a vast mountainous land far to the west of Iceland, a land of glaciers and deep fjords. Most dismissed these as tall tales, but Eric, with nothing to lose and nowhere else to go, decided to see for himself. In the year 982, he gathered his family, his followers, and his livestock, and set sail into the unknown. The journey was a nightmare. The pack ice was a constant threat, a shifting, grinding maze of frozen sea that could crush a wooden ship like an eggshell. But Eric was a master sailor and a stubborn, determined leader. He found a way through. He sailed down the coast of this new land, and he found what he was looking for. A few sheltered fjords on the southwestern tip, where the influence of the warm ocean currents created pockets of green, grassy pasture, starkly beautiful against the backdrop of the immense permanent ice cap that covered the rest of the island. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring this new land, learning its secrets, assessing its potential, and when his sentence was up, he sailed back to Iceland, not as a disgraced outlaw, but as a visionary, a salesman. He knew that Iceland was not a particularly appealing name, so he decided to give his new discovery a name that was a masterpiece of marketing, a piece of brilliant and slightly dishonest propaganda. He called it Greenland. He told the land-hungry farmers of Iceland that this new land was a paradise with endless pastures and rich soil. He painted a picture of a new beginning, a place where a man could carve out a vast estate and live like a king. It was a compelling lie, and people, desperate for land and opportunity, believed him. In 986, Eric the Red led a great expedition of 25 ships filled with hundreds of settlers, their families, and their livestock to colonize Greenland. Only 14 of those ships would make it. The others were lost to storms or turned back. But it was enough. The Viking settlement of Greenland had begun. Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, grew up in this strange, isolated world. He was a child of the frontier. His playground was not a village green, but the rocky shores of a fjord, with a great blue-white glacier looming at its head like a frozen god. He learned to hunt seal and caribou, to fish in the icy waters, and to sail a ship through a sea of icebergs. He inherited his father's ambition and his skill as a sailor, but he seemed to possess a calmer, more thoughtful temperament. While Eric was a man of fire and action, Leif was a man of curiosity and quiet confidence. He had heard the stories, not just of Greenland, but of lands even further to the west, and it was he who would take the final fateful step into the unknown. Leif Erikson was not the first European to see North America. The story of its true discovery is, like so many discoveries, a tale of bad luck, bad weather, and a man who was in the wrong place at the right time. That man was a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Around the year 986, the same year Eric the Red led the main colonization of Greenland, Bjarni set sail from Iceland to join his father, who had gone with Eric's fleet. But Bjarni was a merchant, not an explorer, and he was caught in a classic North Atlantic storm. For days, he was lost in a thick fog, driven far off course by relentless winds. He had no idea where he was. When the fog finally lifted, he saw land, but it was not the land he was expecting. It was not the mountainous, glacier-covered coast of Greenland. This was a land that was low, green, and covered in forests. It was, without a doubt, a new world. But Bjarni was a practical man. His goal was to get to Greenland to see his father. He was not interested in exploring. He was late, he was lost, and he was low on supplies. So he did something that, in retrospect, seems astonishing. He turned away. He sailed north, along the coast of this unknown land, keeping it on his port side. He saw two more distinct landmasses, one flat and forested, the other rocky and topped with glaciers. And then, he finally found his way across the Davis Strait to Greenland. When he arrived, he told his story. He was ridiculed. People called him a man of no ambition, a coward for not even setting foot on this new land. But the stories of the forested coastline, of a land with trees, lingered in the minds of the Greenlanders. For the settlers in Greenland, wood was the most precious commodity imaginable. Their own land was almost completely barren of trees. They had to rely on driftwood for building and fuel. The idea of a land covered in forests, just a few days' sail to the west, was a tantalizing, almost unbelievable prospect. The story reached the ears of Leif Erikson, and Leif, unlike Bjarni, was not a man of no ambition. He was his father's son, a man with a hunger for fame, for wealth, and for the unknown. He was intrigued by Bjarni's tale. He went to Bjarni and he bought his ship. He gathered a crew of 35 men, and he announced his intention. He was going to retrace Bjarni's route in reverse. He was going to find this new wooded land. He was going to do what Bjarni had failed to do. He was going to explore. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and his crew set sail from Greenland, heading west. He was not sailing blindly. He had Bjarni's description of the coastlines. He was a detective, following a trail of clues across the open ocean. His journey would not be an accident. It would be a deliberate act of discovery, the first planned European voyage to the shores of North America. Leif and his crew first came to the land that Bjarni had described last, the one of rock and ice. Leif, being a more practical and descriptive man than his father, decided to name it for its most prominent feature. He called it Helluland, or Stone Slab Land. This was likely Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. It was a harsh, uninviting place, and they did not linger. They sailed south, and they came to the second land Bjarni had seen, the one that was flat and forested. Leif again named it for what he saw. He called it Markland, or Forest Land. This was probably the coast of Labrador. Here they went ashore. They walked under the canopy of trees taller than any they had ever seen. The air was rich with the smell of pine and damp earth. For men from the barren landscapes of Greenland, it must have felt like stepping into a paradise. They cut down trees and loaded timber onto their ship. This alone would have made the voyage a massive success. But Leif was not done. He sailed south again, and he found the land that Bjarni had seen first, the green and fertile country. They found a place where a river flowed out of a lake and into a sheltered bay. The land here was richer than anything they had ever imagined. The sagas describe it in lyrical, almost mythic terms. The rivers were teeming with salmon larger than any they had ever caught. The winters were so mild that the cattle could graze outside all year round. The grass remained green, and most astonishingly of all, they found grapes growing wild. This was a discovery that would give the new land its name. Leif called it Vinland, or Wineland. The presence of grapes, which do not grow as far north as Labrador, is the key clue that tells historians they had reached a place with a more temperate climate, likely Newfoundland, and perhaps even as far south as the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Leif and his men decided to spend the winter in this new paradise. They built a small settlement, a collection of large turf longhouses, a base camp for their explorations. They explored the surrounding countryside, marveling at its resources. They cut more timber, they gathered grapes and dried them into raisins, and they prepared for the journey home. When they returned to Greenland the following spring, their ship loaded with timber and grapes, Leif became a hero. He was no longer just the outlaw's son, he was Leif the Lucky. He had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He had found a land of unimaginable wealth and resources. The stories of Vinland spread like wildfire through the small, isolated communities of Greenland. It seemed for a moment that the Norse had found a new and even more promising world. The stage was set for the first European attempt to colonize North America. Leif Erikson never returned to Vinland. His father, Eric the Red, died shortly after his return, and Leif took over as the chieftain of the Greenland settlement. The responsibilities of leadership kept him at home, but his stories had ignited the imagination of his family. The next voyages to Vinland would be led by his siblings, and it is on these voyages that the Norse would come face to face with the fact that this new world was not, in fact, empty. Leif's brother Thorvald led the next expedition. He and his crew used Leif's settlement as their base and explored the surrounding coastlines. And one day, they came across 3 strange, skin-covered boats on a beach. Underneath them were 9 men. The Norse had encountered the indigenous peoples of North America. The sagas call them Skraelings, a term that probably translates to something like screamers or wretches. It was not a complimentary term. The reaction of the Norse was immediate and brutal. They were Vikings, a people accustomed to violence and preemptive strikes. They attacked. They killed 8 of the men. 1 escaped. It was a fateful, tragic first encounter, an act of unprovoked aggression that would set the tone for all future relations. The lone survivor returned to his people, and soon after, a great fleet of skin boats descended on the Norse camp. A battle ensued. The Norse, with their warriors in hand-to-hand combat, but the indigenous people were master archers. Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, was struck by an arrow and killed. His dying words were prophetic. "We have found a land of fine resources," he said, "though we shall have little joy of it." He was the first European to be buried in North American soil. The next attempt at settlement was the most ambitious. It was led by a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who had married Gudrid, the widow of one of Leif's other brothers. This was not just an exploratory voyage. It was a full-fledged colonization attempt. They set out with several ships, over 100 settlers, including women, and livestock. They intended to stay. They re-established Leif's old settlement, which archaeologists now believe is the site of Lanceau Meadows in northern Newfoundland. And for a time there was peace. The Norse began to trade with the local indigenous people. The Norse had milk and red cloth, which the natives prized. The indigenous people had furs, sable, squirrel, and ermine, which were valuable commodities in Europe. But the relationship was fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust. The cultures were too different, the language barrier absolute. The sagas tell a story of how a bull belonging to the Norse settlers broke loose from its pen and charged, terrifying the indigenous traders, who saw it as a sign of aggression. Another story tells of a Norse woman callously refusing to trade with an indigenous woman. Small incidents, but they built upon the foundation of violence from the first encounter. The fragile peace inevitably shattered. A massive battle broke out. Karlsefni and his men were outnumbered and on the verge of being overrun. It was then that one of the most remarkable figures in the sagas, a woman named Freydis, Leif Eriksson's half-sister, took center stage. Freydis was a fierce, formidable woman, pregnant at the time. Seeing the Norsemen retreating, she berated them for their cowardice. She then picked up the sword of a fallen warrior, beat her bare chest with the flat of the blade, and let out a terrifying war cry. The sight of this wild, screaming, pregnant shield maiden so unnerved the indigenous warriors that they fell back, and the Norse were able to retreat to their camp. But the message was clear. Vinland was not an empty paradise. It was an inhabited land, and its people were not going to be easily displaced. They were numerous, they knew the land, and they were willing to fight to defend it. After 3 years, Thorfinn Karlsefni and the other colonists made a decision. They abandoned the settlement. They packed up their ships and sailed back to Greenland. The first European colony in North America had failed. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is, why? Why did this small settlement, which had access to such incredible resources, not last? The answer is a complex one, a combination of factors that created a perfect storm of failure. The first and most obvious reason was the conflict with the indigenous peoples. The Norse were not colonists in the way we think of the later European powers. They did not have overwhelming technological superiority. Yes, they had iron weapons, but they were vastly outnumbered. They did not have guns or cannons. The population of the Greenland settlement, their only source of reinforcements, was probably never more than a few hundred people. The indigenous population of North America was in the tens, if not hundreds, of thousands. The Norse could win a battle, but they could never win a war. The constant, low-level warfare, the need for constant vigilance, simply made the settlement unsustainable. The second reason was the distance. Vinland was at the very end of a long, tenuous supply chain. The voyage from Greenland was dangerous and unpredictable. The voyage from Iceland was even longer. And the journey from Norway, the ultimate source of Viking power and population, was a massive undertaking. The settlement was simply too far away, too isolated, to be effectively supported. Unlike the later European colonies, which were backed by the full power of nation-states, the Vinland settlement was a private venture. undertaken by a few ambitious families. They were on their own, and finally, there was a change in priorities. Around the same time as the Vinland voyages, the Norse in Europe were undergoing a profound cultural shift. The Viking Age was ending, the raids were stopping. The Norse kingdoms were converting to Christianity and becoming more integrated into the mainstream of European feudal society. The focus was shifting from westward expansion to consolidating power at home. The lure of a dangerous, distant land of trees and grapes simply couldn't compete with the political and economic opportunities in Europe. And so, the Vinland settlement faded into memory and then into myth. The stories were preserved in the Icelandic sagas, but for centuries, most historians dismissed them as fantasy, as folktales. It wasn't until the 1960s when archaeologists Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad unearthed the remains of a Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland that the sagas were proven to be true. They found the remains of turf longhouses, a smithy where iron was worked, and artifacts of unmistakably Norse origin. The proof was there, buried in the soil. The Vikings had been to America. Leif Erikson's journeys are a remarkable but ultimately tragic postscript to the Viking Age. They were a testament to the incredible skill, courage, and ambition of the Norse sailors. They pushed the boundaries of their known world further than any Europeans before them. But they had reached their limit. They had come to a new world, but they were not able to make it their own. The settlement failed not because they were weak, but because they were too few, too far from home, and because they met a people who were not willing to give up their land without a fight. The forgotten journeys of Leif Erikson are a powerful, humbling reminder that not all discoveries lead to conquest, and that even for the fearsome Vikings, some frontiers were simply too vast to be tamed. Our story now turns away from the living, from the desperate struggles of settlers and explorers, and we venture into the silent, sacred world of the Viking dead. We are going to a place where mythology, status, and the hope for an afterlife all converge in one of the most powerful and evocative rituals of the Norse world, the ship burial. To understand the Vikings, you cannot just look at how they lived. You must also look at how they honored their dead, for in their graves, they left behind a map of their souls, their beliefs, and the society they built. Imagine a fjord on a grey, somber day, a great Viking longship, a vessel that has tasted the salt of the North Sea and carried warriors to distant lands is not in the water. It has been dragged ashore, pulled up a gentle slope into a field overlooking the sea. This ship will never sail again. Its final voyage will be into the earth itself. The ship burial was not for everyone. It was the ultimate status symbol, a funeral rite reserved for the most powerful and wealthy individuals, kings, queens, and great chieftains. It was an extravagant, almost theatrical display of power and prestige, a final public declaration of the deceased's importance. To be buried in a ship was to be sent into the afterlife not as a humble spirit, but as a magnificent lord, equipped with all the necessities and luxuries you would need to maintain your status in the next world. The ritual itself was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of hundreds of people. A great trench would be dug, long and deep enough to hold the entire vessel. The ship would be carefully lowered into this earthen dry dock, and then the ship would be furnished, transformed from a vessel of war into a floating death chamber. At the center of the ship, a wooden burial chamber, like a small house, would be built. Inside this chamber, the body of the deceased would be laid to rest on a bed of fine linens and pillows, dressed in their most magnificent clothing, silks from Byzantium, fine wool embroidered with gold and silver thread. And they would not be sent into the afterlife alone. They would be surrounded by everything that had defined their life and their power. This is where the Viking burial ship becomes a time capsule, a treasure trove for future archaeologists. The items buried with the dead tell us a story, a detailed and personal biography of the person laid to rest. A great warrior might be buried with his full set of arms, his sword, its hilt intricately decorated with silver and garnet, his shield, its bright paint long since faded, his spear and his axe, and his helmet, a rare and precious object. He would be buried with his horse, and sometimes his hunting dogs, all sacrificed to serve him in the next world. A wealthy woman, a powerful matriarch or queen, would be buried with the symbols of her power and authority. Her jewelry, gleaming brooches, necklaces of glass beads and silver pendants. Her keys, the symbol of her control over the household and its wealth. And the tools of her trade, her loom and weaving implements, her spindles, her scissors. These were not humble domestic tools. They were the instruments through which she created wealth and status for her family. But the grave goods were not just personal possessions. They were provisions for a journey. Cauldrons, cooking pots, and buckets were included. Joints of meat, heaps of grain, and barrels of ale were placed on board. The ship was a fully stocked vessel, ready to sail the dark waters that separated the world of the living from the world of the dead. And then came the most chilling and controversial aspect of the ship burial: the human sacrifices. The sagas and accounts from foreign travelers like the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan describe in graphic detail how slaves, particularly young women, would be sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. The archaeological evidence confirms this. In the great ship burials, like the one unearthed at Oseberg in Norway, the skeletons of multiple other individuals, mostly women, have been found alongside the main burial. They were not just servants. They were a final, terrible display of the deceased's power, a demonstration that their authority extended even beyond the veil of death. They owned people, and they could take them with them. Once the ship was fully furnished, once the bodies and the grave goods were all in place, the final stage of the ritual would begin. Sometimes, the entire ship and its contents would be covered by a massive mound of earth and stone, creating a permanent landmark on the horizon, a man-made hill that would stand for 1,000 years as a monument to the great person buried within. In other cases, particularly in accounts from Russia, the ship would be set ablaze, becoming a spectacular funeral pyre, a blazing torch that would consume the body and send the spirit soaring up to the heavens in a column of fire and smoke. The ship burial was more than just a funeral. It was a piece of mythic theatre. The ship was the vessel that would carry the soul to the afterlife. For a warrior, the destination might be Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where he would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. For others, it might be the shadowy realm of Hel, or the peaceful fields of Folkvanga, ruled by the goddess Freya. The ship was the key, the magical transport that could cross the boundary between worlds. It was the ultimate expression of the Norse belief that life was a voyage, and death was simply the beginning of the final and most important journey of all. In 1904, a farmer on the Oseberg farm near the coast of Norway noticed a large, unusually shaped mound on his property. He began to dig. What he and the archaeologists who soon joined him would uncover was the single most spectacular Viking artifact ever found, a window into the world of the Norse elite that was so perfectly preserved it felt as though its owners had just stepped away. They had found the Oseberg ship burial. The mound was massive, and the anaerobic blue clay in which the ship was buried had preserved the wood and organic materials to an astonishing degree. As the archaeologists carefully peeled back the layers of earth, the ship emerged, almost completely intact. It was a breathtakingly beautiful vessel, a carve, a type of longship used for coastal travel. It was not a warship, but a vessel of high status, almost a royal yacht. Its prow and stern were carved into intricate, swirling, snake-like patterns, a masterpiece of Viking art. The ship itself was old, built around the year 820 AD, and had clearly seen service on the water before it was repurposed for its final sacred duty. The burial had taken place around the year 834 AD. Inside the ship, in a timbered burial chamber, lay the skeletons of two women. For years, their identities have been a source of intense debate. Who were these two women, who were granted such a magnificent, high-status burial, a funeral that would have been fit for a great king? One woman was elderly, probably in her 70s or 80s. Her skeleton showed signs of advanced age, of a life lived long and hard. The other woman was younger, perhaps around 50. Modern scientific analysis has revealed much about them. The older woman seems to have suffered from cancer, a disease that must have caused her great pain. The younger woman's collarbone was broken, an injury that would have been healing at the time of her death. DNA analysis has suggested she may have had ancestry from the Black Sea region, hinting at the vast trading networks of the Viking world. The prevailing theory is that the older woman was the primary occupant of the grave, a queen or a powerful matriarch, a woman of immense authority. The younger woman, then, may have been her companion, her servant, or a relative, sacrificed to accompany her into the afterlife. But another theory suggests that the roles could have been reversed, or that they were both women of high status, perhaps a queen and her priestess, a Völva, one of the powerful female seers of the Norse world. The mystery endures, but it is the grave goods buried with them that truly take the breath away. The Oseberg burial is a treasure chest of everyday life in the Viking Age, preserved for 1,000 years. There was a richly carved wooden cart, its sides decorated with scenes from Norse mythology. There were 3 ornate sledges, also intricately carved. There were beds, chairs, and chests. There were kitchen utensils, cooking pots, and knives. There was a loom and other weaving tools, a testament to the importance of textile production as a source of female power and wealth. There were buckets filled with wild apples and walnuts. The remains of a sacrificed ox and 4 horses were found, along with more than a dozen dogs. And there were personal items, combs made of bone, fine silk textiles imported from the East, and fragments of a beautiful tapestry that depicted scenes of warriors, gods, and mythic beasts. The Oseberg ship tells us a powerful story about the role of women in Viking society. This was not a simple, patriarchal world where men held all the power. Clearly, women could achieve positions of immense authority and command the resources necessary for a truly spectacular funeral. Whether she was a queen, a priestess, or a great land-owning matriarch, the Lady of Oseberg was a person of supreme importance. Her burial ship is not just an archaeological find, it is a monument to female power in the Viking Age. It is also a testament to the Norse view of the afterlife. This was not a shadowy, ethereal realm. It was a place where you would need your cart, your bed, your cooking pots, and your servants. It was a continuation of your life on Earth, and you had to arrive prepared. The Oseberg ship was a vessel fully equipped for that final journey, a magnificent floating household sent to sail the seas of eternity, carrying its powerful mistresses to their rightful place in the next world. Not all Viking burials were as spectacular as the one at Oseberg. In fact, ship burials were rare. Most Vikings were buried in simple graves, either cremated with their ashes placed in an urn, or inhumed in a modest grave marked by a pile of stones. But even these simpler burials, when unearthed by archaeologists, provide a wealth of information about Viking culture, their beliefs, and their social structure. The items buried with the dead are the clues, the small personal objects that whisper stories across the centuries. The most common grave goods found with Viking men are weapons. A man's sword was his most prized possession. It was often a thing of great beauty and value, its hilt inlaid with precious metals. Swords were so valuable that they were often passed down through generations, acquiring names and histories of their own. To be buried with your sword was a sign of your status as a free man and a warrior. Alongside the sword, you would often find a spear, the most common weapon of the Viking Age, and the fearsome Viking axe, a tool that was equally useful for splitting logs and splitting skulls. But it wasn't just about weapons. A man's personal grooming was also clearly important. Male graves frequently contain beautiful combs made of bone or antler, often kept in their own protective cases. Tweezers and small ear spoons for cleaning wax from the ears are also common. The stereotype of the dirty, unkempt Viking is a myth. The archaeological evidence shows that they were a people who took great pride in their appearance, their well-kept beards, and their stylish hair. The graves of women tell a different, but equally fascinating story. The most iconic object found in female graves is a pair of oval brooches, often made of bronze and intricately decorated. These were worn on the shoulders to fasten a woman's outer garment, a kind of pinafore dress. A third, decorative brooch was often worn at the neck, and strings of glass and amber beads were frequently strung between the brooches. This was the standard formal wear for a high-status Viking woman, a clear and recognizable symbol of her identity. Like the men, women were also buried with the tools of their trade. Spindles and whorls, used for spinning yarn, and weaving swords, used for beating the thread tight on a loom, are common finds. These objects tell us that textile production was not just a domestic chore. It was a highly valued skill, a key part of the Viking economy. A woman who could produce fine cloth was a woman of considerable economic importance. And then there are the objects that blur the lines, the finds that challenge our modern assumptions about gender roles. Archaeologists have unearthed graves that contain a mixture of traditionally male and female objects. The most famous of these is the grave of the Birka warrior. For years, this lavish 10th century grave in Sweden was assumed to be that of a great male chieftain. It contained a full set of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, as well as 2 horses and a full set of gaming pieces, suggesting a strategic mind. It was the archetypal Viking warrior grave. But in 2017, DNA analysis of the bones revealed a stunning surprise. The warrior of Birka was a woman. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. It was concrete, scientific proof for the existence of the Shield Maiden, the female warrior who had long been thought to be a mere legend, a creation of the sagas. It forces us to reconsider our understanding of Viking society. It was clearly a world with more fluidity, more complexity, and more opportunity for women to step into roles of power and authority than we had ever previously imagined. Every object in a grave tells a story. A simple iron knife, a string of colored beads, a well-worn gaming piece. These are not just artifacts. They are the last possessions of a living, breathing person. They are the clues left behind, intentionally or not, that allow us to piece together the puzzle of their lives, their beliefs, and the world they inhabited. In the silent clay of the grave, the Vikings speak to us still. Our final stop in this exploration of Viking life takes us into the heart of their society, into the warm, smoky, and often dangerous world of the Great Feasting Hall. This was the center of Viking political and social life, the place where power was displayed, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or broken. To understand the Viking elite, you must understand the theater of the Mead Hall. Imagine you are a warrior in the service of a powerful jarl or chieftain. You have just returned from a successful raid, your ship heavy with silver and plunder. You enter the jarl's longhouse, a massive timbered hall, its walls hung with brightly colored tapestries and shields. The air is thick with the smoke from the long fire pits and the smell of roasting meat. The hall is crowded with the jarl's household warriors, his herd, all of them drinking, laughing, and boasting of their deeds. You take your place on one of the long wooden benches. A slave brings you a drinking horn, filled to the brim with mead, the sweet, potent honey wine of the Vikings. The feast begins. Great joints of roasted pork and beef are brought out on wooden platters. You eat with your knife and your fingers, the grease running down your chin. The drinking is deep and competitive. Toasts are made to the gods, to the jarl, and to the memory of fallen comrades. This is not just a party. This is a carefully orchestrated political event. Your place on the bench is determined by your rank and your reputation. The most honored warriors sit closest to the jarl in the center of the hall. To be invited to sit on the high seat next to the jarl is the greatest honor of all. The feast is a public display of the jarl's wealth and generosity. A jarl's power is measured by his ability to provide for his followers, to reward them for their loyalty. A jarl who is stingy, who provides poor food and weak ale, will quickly lose the respect of his men. They will leave him and find a more generous lord to serve. At the heart of the feast is the poet, the skald. The skald is not just an entertainer. He is a vital political figure. He is the keeper of history, the maker of reputations. He stands before the fire, and to the accompaniment of a harp or lyre, he recites the great epic poems. But he also composes new poems, poems that praise the generosity and courage of his jarl, and celebrate the great deeds of the warriors in the hall. To have a poem composed in your honor is to achieve a form of immortality. Your name will be remembered. Your deeds will be sung in the halls of other jarls for generations to come. The skald's words are as powerful as any sword. He can build a man's reputation or he can destroy it with a poem of insult and satire. The feast is also a time for gift-giving. After the poetry, the jarl will stand and call forth his most valued warriors. He will reward them for their service with gifts. A fine sword, a gold ring, an armband of twisted silver. This is the core of the relationship between a lord and his follower. The warrior provides loyalty and military service. The lord provides wealth and treasure. The gift is a public symbol of this bond. To receive a ring from your jarl is to be a ring-giver's man. It is a pledge of allegiance, sealed in precious metal. But the hall is also a place of tension and potential violence. The combination of alcohol, boasting, and armed men is a volatile one. Rivalries simmer just beneath the surface. An ill-chosen word, a perceived insult, can quickly erupt into a deadly brawl. The sagas are full of stories of feasts that end in bloodshed, of old feuds being rekindled over a drinking horn. Hospitality is a sacred duty in the Viking world, but the feasting hall is a place where a man must always be on his guard. It is a stage where the drama of Viking life plays out, a world of loyalty and betrayal, of poetry and violence, of gift-giving and raw, untamed power. To sit in the hall of a jarl is to be at the very center of the Viking universe, a place of warmth and light, surrounded by the darkness and the cold.